This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for September 23rd, 2022, and I'm going to be talking about the mobilization, the referendums, the West's reaction to it, and ultimately what this all means, what the implications are. So first things first, let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map, so please keep that in mind when looking at this information. But even still, when we zoom into southern Ukraine, the Kherson region, which is now voting on joining the Russian Federation, you can see the front line between Russian forces and Ukrainian forces after Ukraine launched its first and largest offensive. That remains unchanged. Ukraine continues putting pressure on Russian defenses there, but the offensive itself is more or less over. Now, a lot of Russian sources and even some Ukrainian sources continue to talk about a potential offensive between Zaporizhzhia and Vuhledar, just north of Mariupol, a potential offensive around here, even perhaps attempting to take the nuclear power plant, which is right around here. There is activity around Donetsk city and also Bakhmut. This is Russian forces moving into Ukrainian-held territory. And then in the very north of the Donbas region, Ukrainian forces are pushing toward Lyman. This is the remnants of Ukraine's Kharkov offensive. They are trying to push into Lyman. They're also contesting this defensive line created by the Oskol River. There is a lot of fighting around Kupiansk. You can see if you zoom in real close, you can see the town kind of straddles the river. And the Ukrainian forces are on the west bank, Russian forces on the east, and they are fighting over Kupiansk. And so we need to keep a close eye on all of these areas because this is where Ukraine could possibly make additional progress. Nowhere near at the pace that they were making in Kharkov, because now they're fighting where Russian forces are standing and fighting back. So it remains to be seen what happens there. But with the announcement of the mobilization and with these referendums, a lot is going to change. And I think it's going to change a lot faster than some people seem to think. We've all heard that Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization. 300,000 reservists are being called up. This is not a draft. This isn't picking random Russian citizens and pressing them into military service. They had been in the military, they have training, they have since left, they are still with a reservist status, they can be called back, so they are. And they have specific skill sets that are required. During the speech, President Putin said they will be trained. I've heard timelines ranging from a month to 3 months of training. Now, having been in the U.S. military myself, I served for about 4 years. I had been out since probably 2003, 2004. If you said, Brian, you got to go back into the military, we're going to give you 3 months of training to get back into the swing of things, I would think 3 months is more than enough. It is a very comfortable margin to get yourself back into shape. I think 1 month would be good enough. 3 months would be very, very good. I would feel very prepared after 3 months of refreshing my memory. I mean, even at this point, I still remember how to take apart an M16, the fundamentals of marksmanship, how to dig a trench. I remember all of that. It's stuff that sticks with you. And I've been out way longer than all of these reservists that are being called up in Russia. They're younger. Their service was much more recently, and it'll be much fresher in their mind, whatever their specialty was. In addition to 300,000 Russian soldiers being mobilized and now working their way toward the front, you have these referendums. Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Lugansk. The voting is taking place today. It'll be over on the 27th this month, September. And then they will, for all intents and purposes, be part of the Russian Federation. And so you're expanding the number of troops involved by three times, at least, 3 times larger, the force. And now you're expanding the scope of Russian military activity in these regions and beyond, because now it's not just a special military operation in Ukraine, it is a military operation to defend what Moscow considers Russian territory. And as all of this is happening, Russia has also been incrementally increasing the intensity of its military operations already, in the sense that they are hitting critical infrastructure. They are hitting Ukraine's power grid, railroad infrastructure, a lot of things that they have been kind of leaving alone for the most part. Now they are hitting it. And we can only expect this to continue to escalate as these two additional measures come into force. What about the West's reaction to the announcement of the mobilization, their reaction to the referendums? Let's take a look at this Sky News article. There's also a video right here at the top that you can watch, and it says Russian reserves are not trained for war, and Putin's escalation could be extremely dangerous, military expert says. And they also say Vladimir Putin has mobilized Russian troops for the first time since the Second World War as he tries to regain the initiative. But the decision could prove ill-considered as the reserves head to an incredibly hostile environment where Ukraine is in the ascendancy, which I didn't know that. I knew that Ukraine launched 2 offensives, one in Kherson, a catastrophic failure, huge losses in terms of men and machines, something so catastrophically gone astray that even the Western media couldn't cover it up. I've talked about this Washington Post article many times. Wounded Ukrainian soldiers reveal steep toll of Kherson offensive. 5 Ukrainians dead for every 1 Russian. Lopsided fighting favoring the Russians. Outgunned in terms of number of guns, in terms of the amount of ammunition, the capability of Russian weapons versus the inabilities of Ukrainian weapons, even though a lot of the equipment they went into the offensive with was transferred to them from the West. Same goes for Kharkov. They took a lot of territory. There were no Russian forces in the area, hardly any, and those that were there immediately retreated, set up a defensive line, and fell back behind it across the Oskol River. And this is, again, something that even Western analysts have admitted. So that's not on the ascendancy. That is an all or nothing offensive launched, half of it a complete failure, the other half of it a temporary and mixed success, because you took territory but you failed to inflict any significant damage on the enemy that you're trying to throw out of your country, who is now reorganizing and getting ready to fight, and now they're going to triple the size of their force. So all things to consider. The expert that they're citing is some former UK military senior officer, and he actually claimed that adding 300,000 Russian troops into this conflict is not going to make any difference. It's not going to be a game changer. That is what he said. And I don't even know how you could say that. All of the claims that you're going to hear people make about the Russian mobilization and these 300,000 reservists coming in, everything you can say about them, you can also say about the Ukrainian troops being mobilized in the most recent waves of mobilization. What kind of training and background do they have? What kind of training are they receiving before they go to the front line? They're telling you, even in Western media reports, that they're getting no training, they're not getting adequate equipment, and they're just being thrown into the front, which actually sounds a lot worse than what Russia plans on doing with these 300,000 reservists. There's also the impression trying to be made across the Western media that Russia did this impulsively. They saw the Kharkov offensive unfold, they lost all of this territory, and now this is a knee-jerk reaction, this mobilization. But I don't think that it is. I've seen Western analysts like Michael Kaufman. He belongs to one of these US-based think tanks. He's a military analyst. He's cited across the Western media. And for months, I heard him talking about how Russia was getting this reserve mobilization network ready. They were already looking at who was available, and it looked like they were getting ready to use it in one way or another. And he was right, they were. And so this is not something that Putin just decided over the weekend. This is something that has been in the works for a while. And I am actually going to make the case that this is part of a long-planned incremental escalation that Russia was preparing for before they stepped foot in Ukraine in late February. I'm going to make that argument in just a moment. Same goes for the referendums. This move to hold these referendums is not a knee-jerk reaction. They were preparing to hold these referendums all along. And a lot of this analysis that we're hearing about the mobilization and the referendums being, off-the-cuff decisions made out of desperation, it sounds very similar to these claims we heard about Russia thinking they were going to win the conflict in 3 days. And then on day 4, they had to fall back, and they've become increasingly desperate ever since. And this is simply not true. Even the Pentagon, in all of their briefings from February and March onward, they talked about how much military equipment and men and ammunition that they assembled along the border with Ukraine for this operation ahead of time, knowing full well it was going to be intense and protracted warfare. They knew this. They were prepared for it. Obviously, they knew it was going to take longer than 3 days. They were fully prepared for it to take longer than 3 days. And in the same sense, it may be that Russia planned to do a mobilization all along, knowing that eventually they would need more forces. Former U.S. Marine officer and former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter has been saying this for months and months, that they don't have enough troops. If they want to take Odessa, if they want to hold this line, if they want to also hold all of this territory and fight off these offensives made possible by U.S. military aid, they're going to need more troops. And he was absolutely right. Michael Kaufman, a Ukrainian-born pro-NATO military analyst cited across the Western media, he also said the same thing. If Russian forces want to go into Odessa, they don't have enough troops. They don't have enough troops to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk in the Donetsk Oblast. So how are they going to take Odessa? This is what he was saying. Unless they did some sort of mobilization. Well, now they are. Those forces are coming. Let's actually look at what Michael Kaufman said about mobilization. As a matter of fact, he did a whole thread on it, and I'll put the link to it in the video description below. And I'm going to read through it, and I'm going to stop and add a little commentary here and there as I go. It's kind of long, but bear with me. These are reoccurring points you will hear made across the entire Western media. So he starts out and he says, a few incomplete thoughts on the question of mobilization. It won't solve many of the Russian military challenges in this war, but it could alter the dynamic. Fair to say that these are uncharted waters, and so we should take care with deterministic and definitive claims. And he's saying this because a lot of the things that he has been saying all along have been wrong, but okay, he's wrong. At least he's being more careful now. So give credit where credit's due. He goes on and he says, I wouldn't suggest that this can turn around Russia's fortunes in the war. However, I would take care being overly dismissive, especially looking out towards the medium term of this winter and 2023. Force availability and manpower matters, hence the implications can vary. The Russian military has had structural manpower deficits throughout the war, leading to problems with recruitment, retention, and rotation. Units can't be rotated, leading to exhaustion. Number of refuseniks grew. Hiring short-term volunteers exasperated retention issues. And I want to point out here real quick that everything that he's saying about this mobilization goes for Ukraine's forces as well. They do not have a huge pool of trained manpower that they are drawing from anymore. Even he has admitted this. If he does regular podcasts with Ryan Evans on War on the Rocks, I've linked and talked about them, linked to them and talked about them in the past. And he has talked about how Ukraine is suffering the same problem. They have a trained manpower deficiency. They're having problems with equipment. They're getting equipment from the West. Maybe they get a brigade's worth of equipment, but it's more complicated than just matching that equipment with the number of men that are in a brigade. There are training requirements necessary to transform these numbers into an actual functioning and efficient brigade on the battlefield. And he has kind of come around to that thinking, and he has actually admitted this. So you have to always keep that in mind when you hear these criticisms about Russia, its mobilization, the training of these forces, bringing them in, sustaining them on the battlefield. The same goes for Ukraine's forces. He continues, he says, piecemeal solutions have led the Russian military to steadily cannibalize the force, using up officers, equipment, and enlisted professionals for reserve and volunteer units. Hence, force quality degraded over time, as did morale, retention, and exhaustion problems grew worse. And of course, it's the same story for Ukraine. How couldn't it be? But I just want to point something out here. All of these negative things we keep hearing about the Russian military. They got command and control problems. They got logistical problems, low morale, bad leadership, bad unit cohesion. But when Ukrainian forces, during this latest wave of offensives, when they went up against a predominantly Russian military force, well prepared and ready to stand and fight, Ukraine got annihilated. They tried to storm Kherson. Russian forces were ready, about a division of Russian forces with their defenses prepared, completely annihilated the offensive. We have articles like this. I've gone over this many times. Wounded Ukrainian soldiers reveal steep toll of Kherson offensive. This is from the Washington Post. These are Ukrainians explaining how lopsided the fighting was, how every Russian killed, 5 Ukrainians died, how lopsided the fighting was in terms of the quantity of guns and the quality of Russian artillery versus Ukrainian artillery. And the fact that everything they did was being watched by Russian drones, how they weren't able to move without attracting artillery fire, and how even when they turned on their phones to call their families at night when they were off duty, Russian forces could detect that with electronic warfare and then hit them with artillery. So maybe Russia has these problems, but they're still able to show up for the fight and overwhelmingly defeat Ukraine. That is the story being told here on the battlefield. All of these claims about Russia's deficiencies, okay, but the story on the battlefield tells me a different story. That whatever their shortcomings may be, it's not nearly as bad as whatever shortcomings led to this catastrophic failure of Ukrainian forces around Kherson. Now, you could say, well, what about Kharkov? Again, it's Michael Kaufman himself who admitted there were no real Russian forces in Kharkov. It was practically undefended. The local militia forces in the region were some of the most unprepared forces available. And so what was that? Was that an actual success over Russian military forces? Or was it a success over the inability of Russia to defend everywhere all at once, and now is bringing 300,000 extra soldiers going to at least partly remedy that? I think the answer is yes. And I think it's an answer, a yes answer that a lot of people don't want to admit. He goes on and he says, mobilizing LDNR personnel, I guess he's talking about the local militias, and using them to absorb losses led to a variegated force that lacked cohesion, interoperability, and suffered from weak morale. This approach seems to have largely exhausted itself in July. Few men left to forcibly mobilize in LDNR. The first and more important implication is not mobilization, but enactment of stop-loss policies. Service contracts extended indefinitely, right to refuse deployment suspended, new criminal measures enacted to enforce what is de facto introduction of wartime measures. Caveat: this is an initial interpretation of the order, but it implies that you can no longer tear up your contract in the Russian military or leave service. Volunteers who signed up for short tours, 4 to 6 months, are now extended for the duration of the mobilization period. All mobilized personnel will be treated as contract servicemen subject to these conditions. The situation with conscripts appears unchanged, but if Russia annexes these 4 Ukrainian regions, then it can technically deploy conscripts in those territories as well, which may be true. But I think that if Russia sends conscripts into these regions, they're going to be in the rear areas, very, very far away from the action, so that they can free up soldiers who are more appropriate to have closer to the front line. The optimal time for Russia to conduct mobilization was in April, before significant parts of the force and mobilization base were ineffectually consumed. So what can this partial mobilization achieve for Russia at this stage? The disappointing answer is it depends. The first limit on mobilization is likely to be throughput. The system has to call up, house, train, feed, equip, etc. Hence, Shoigu's 300,000 number is likely to be notional, while actual mobilization proceed as a much more limited and phased process. That may be true, maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. That said, I'm skeptical that mobilization infrastructure has sat entirely dormant. And this is something that I have heard Michael Kaufman himself refer to over and over again. Before mobilization eventually happened, he kept saying that it looked like they were looking at this infrastructure for mobilization, getting it ready for something what he did not know. So he seems to be well informed, and he seems to have seen this in the works. But because it's something that has been in the works for so long, people should think about what that means. It doesn't mean that President Putin impulsively ordered this mobilization. This is part of an incremental escalation that seems like it was planned well ahead of time. I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a moment. That said, I'm skeptical that mobilization infrastructure has sat entirely dormant. Russian voenkomats have been calling people up to update their information since April. Assembling reserve and volunteer battalions likely exercise some of this system already. And he goes on and he says, since units typically train their personnel, it's unclear what the capacity is in the system to absorb mobilized officers, soldiers, train them, and equip them. These are all uncertainties. Russian training of the Third Corps might be an example of the approach or not. And he's talking about this new Third Corps force that was stood up, and it was given all of the latest military equipment, some of the latest and best military equipment Russia has to offer. It's somewhat significant in size, and it's already been sent into Ukraine. However, the Russian military could use mobilized personnel first to raise manning levels in currently deployed BTGs, battalion tactical groups, many of which seem to be at 40 to 50%, well, based on what numbers. Morale of mobilized personnel might be low, but individual replacements can start filling these units out faster than establishing new units. Okay. It doesn't matter. Whatever level these units are at, they're probably not at full strength. And so you would definitely use some of these mobilized forces to fill them up to full capacity. Is Ukraine able to do something similar? Ask yourself that. Another approach might be to deploy lower quality infantry regiments akin to those currently seen among the mobilized local militias in order to hold large stretches of the line, which would be the opposite of the Third Corps effort to stand up a new volunteer formation with better kit. The second main limitation stems from constraints on force employment. No matter how many personnel are mobilized, the Russian military can only sustain and command a finite number of troops. On the battlefield, scaling has been one of the Russian military's chief problems in the war. And I think that this is a myth. I think a lot of this is based on a misinterpretation of Russia's opening phase of this operation, this rush to Kiev and Sumy and Kherson and Mariupol. I believe that it was a very risky, high cost, low probability of success, but they thought it was worth a shot if it could shorten the duration of the conflict. They knew ahead of time would otherwise take months or longer to fight because they prepared the men, the machines, the munitions to fight for months and months or longer. People interpreted that as just bad logistics, bad command and control, bad planning, and I don't think that it was. Compare that to the Russian military's performance around Kherson during the opening phases of Ukraine's offensive and how soundly they defeated those Ukrainian forces. And remember, we were told by the Western media that those Russian forces were being cut off from their supply lines, and they still managed to just lopsidedly defeat Ukrainian advances. Keep all of that in mind. Russian capacity to implement partial mobilization is uncertain, as is the time it would take to produce results and how Russians will react to it. However, I'm also not sanguine on the proposition that it'll make no difference. There's room for caution here. Okay, that's fair enough. Morale will continue to be an issue. Stop-loss policies may yield fewer refuseniks, but more deserters. Most Ukrainian advantages will remain, and I honestly don't know what those advantages are, because after 300,000 Russian forces are introduced, the one advantage that Ukraine did have, which was an overabundance of manpower, even if they were untrained and under-equipped, that is going to be negated to a large extent. What partial mobilization may do in the coming months, depending on what actually comes of it, is help Russia stabilize their lines. This is in part why these coming months remain an important window of opportunity for Ukraine to retake territory. Over the winter, the contest will likely be one more defined by attrition and reconstitution. The extent to which mobilization can help Russia reconstitute is unclear. Mobilization comes with significant political risks and downsides for Moscow, but it could extend Russia's ability to sustain this war more so than alter the outcome. Michael Kaufman, I think, seems to believe that the outcome is a resounding Ukrainian victory somehow. As always, these are just initial impressions and a very imperfect reading at best. Perhaps a useful addition: mobilization and stop-loss might help Moscow stem the deteriorating quantity of the force, but not the deteriorating quality of the force and its morale. Having used up its best equipment, officers, and personnel, I don't see how this can be recovered. Same goes for Ukraine. How can it be recovered? It's not going to be recovered. Again, if Russia is losing men and equipment, Ukraine is losing it many times faster and more permanently, I would say. So this is a good time to talk about General Shoigu's numbers that he cited. 5,900, let's say around 6,000 Russian soldiers died. This is what General Shoigu said. 61,000 Ukrainian soldiers dead. That means Russia is killing about 10 Ukrainians for every one they lose. This does not count the militias, local militia losses. That is a trend that is going to continue. There's nothing that's going to change that trend. When you introduce 300,000 more Russian soldiers into the mix and you expand the latitude with which these soldiers can act on the battlefield, do you think that is going to accelerate that trend or reverse it? Just think about it. It's common sense. You will hear people say, Brian, 6,000 dead Russian soldiers, that's ridiculous, as it's something like 70,000 or 80,000 Russian soldiers dead. They're dead. Not just injured, dead. But the problem is I've never heard that number broken down or explained. I just hear the US repeating what Ukraine says, and I've never heard Ukraine explain where this number came from. But I could explain to you this 61,000 that Shoigu claimed represents the number of dead Ukrainian soldiers. So let's run through the numbers. Kiev itself has admitted that on a normal day of fighting, they are losing between 100 and 200 Ukrainian troops. Dead, not injured, dead. Many more wounded. And I don't think that it's a stretch to imagine that Ukraine is downplaying the number of soldiers that they are losing daily on average. But let's give them benefit of the doubt and go with 200. It's the higher of the two numbers. If they're downplaying, it would be higher, but let's just go with 200. 200 dead for 7 months, that's about 42,000 dead. 42,000 dead, just average losses day to day. But of course, they just launched this offensive, and Russia claims that up to 7,000 Ukrainian soldiers died. So that's 49,000. That's up to 49,000. Shoigu is saying 61,000 dead in total. So we're already up to 49,000. And again, even the Western media admits that at least the Kherson offensive was a catastrophic failure, and there were huge losses of life and equipment on Ukraine's side. Now, every couple of days per week, Russia does these missile strikes. They attack concentrations of Ukrainian troops. And so the daily number 100 to 200 can triple, quadruple, or more. And then when you look at that a couple of times a week over 7 months, you easily arrive at 61,000. It's a very realistic number. When you read the Washington Post, that article, wounded Ukrainian soldiers reveal steep toll of Kherson offensive. During the offensive, they're admitting that they're attacking the Russians with everything that they have, and they're losing 5 Ukrainian soldiers for every Russian that they kill. That's under the circumstances of an offensive where they're attacking Russian forces. What about just the daily grind where Russia is leveraging their artillery, their rockets, their missiles, their military aviation? They're fighting at long ranges, pummeling Ukrainian defenses. How exactly is Ukraine killing large numbers of Russian troops in return? How is that happening? If they're outgunned, outranged, outmatched, how are they killing all of these Russian soldiers to get to levels around 70, 80,000? It just doesn't make any sense. I've never heard even an attempt to logically explain it. And I don't think that you can explain it, because I think it's just pure war propaganda. I think the number General Shoigu gave, around 6,000, is a very reasonable number. 61,000 Ukrainian dead, also a very reasonable number. General Shoigu also says that Ukraine mobilized up to 300,000 men. So 61,000 plus another 49,000 wounded and not coming back to the fight. That's about 100,000. That's a third. That's a third of Ukraine's force gone, just under the conditions of this special military operation, which is now about to be escalated in more than one way. Ukraine is visibly running out of things like ammunition, artillery, tanks, armored vehicles. This is why they're constantly asking the West to send more. It's not because they've got more tankers than artillery men. It's because their tanks and their artillery are being destroyed, and they need to replace it. The West has been sending this equipment, but in smaller and smaller numbers. Say M777s, they sent a little over 100, maybe 120, let's just say 150 altogether. And they have not sent any more since then. They're now sending, that's 155 millimeter artillery. Now they're sending 105 millimeter round artillery systems to Ukraine, and a smaller and smaller amount of ammunition to go along with it. So the West is emptying out their inventories, and they don't have the industrial capacity to replace them in a timely manner. Russia apparently does. When you take all of this together, and you think about 300,000 extra soldiers being thrown into the mix, the fact that these regions that Russian forces are now in Ukraine becoming part of the Russian Federation, and their mandate to protect that territory greatly expanded, I think that this really spells trouble for Ukraine at a very vulnerable time, where they just launched these costly offensives. They expended a lot of the hardware that the West transferred to them over the course of several months. The West does not have that to give to them again, and Ukraine does not have months to wait to assemble it, integrate it, and prepare it for another offensive. They just don't, they're out of time. Now, something else you heard Michael Kaufman talk about, and Sky News and many other Western outlets and many Western leaders, they're claiming this mobilization is going to put Russian society into upheaval. And I just don't see how. And again, this is another one of these claims that are made and never explained. Look at this Time magazine article from August. So this is relatively recent. This is last month. Why Russian support for the war in Ukraine hasn't wavered. Now, listen to this. Exactly 6 months have passed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so much has changed. At least 12 million Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes, half of whom have fled the country as refugees. NATO is on the verge of its most significant expansion in decades. No, it's not. One that will more than double its borders with Russia. While the impact of the war is most acutely felt in Ukraine, which has suffered thousands of civilian and military casualties and billions of dollars in infrastructure damage, reverberations in the form of food and energy crises are being experienced across the globe. But one thing that hasn't seemed to change is Russian public opinion. According to the Levada Center, an independent polling agency in Moscow, it is not independent, I'll get to that in a minute, More than 3/4 of Russians continue to support what the Kremlin calls its special military operation in Ukraine, with just 18% opposed. Putin's approval rating is similarly high at 83%, a figure that has only risen since the war began. A slightly smaller, but nonetheless consistent majority of the public believe that the country is headed in the right direction. That was just last month. And if you go online and you look at Telegram and you look at what Russian people are saying about this, if anything, they were begging the government to escalate. They wanted mobilization. They wanted to do this faster and in a more complete manner than this special military operation allowed. Now, what about the Levada Center? Because some people will say, well, the Levada Center, who are they? Maybe they're just making up these numbers. They are funded by the U.S. government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Here's their little webpage on the NED's website. Russia polling for democracy, the Yuri Levada Analytical Center. And it says the Yuri Levada Analytical Center, an NED grantee based in Moscow, is an independent polling agency that is well known for its surveys on socio-political issues both within Russia and worldwide. Well, how can you be independent if you depend on US government money? So maybe it's just independent of Russian interests. Maybe that's what they meant. So there are anti-mobilization protests in Russia, but it represents an extreme minority. And of course, the Western media is going to blow it out of proportion. But if 18% are opposed and everyone else is in support of the special military operation, mobilization is not going to create widespread social upheaval in Russia. Now, let me get into why I believe that this was part of a planned incremental escalation. It was done very deliberately for very real political reasons, political realities that Russia could not get around. And let's kind of look at how this has all unfolded. So a lot of people all the way back in 2014, maybe some people don't remember this, but a lot of people back in 2014 wondered why Russia didn't do all of this then. Because what the US did was overthrew an elected government. They put a client regime into power in Kiev, bolstered by literal Nazis. And they were transforming Ukraine into a national security threat on Russia's border. And if you look at papers like the 2019 Rand Corporation document extending Russia, they were doing this deliberately to provoke Russia. This was not something that Russia was irrationally reacting to. This is something the US did on purpose, knowing that Russia would have to react to it and that it would overextend them economically and militarily. That was the whole plan. That was why the US did this in 2014. But Russia did not. They did not intervene. They did not invade Ukraine. They did not try to take over the whole country or overthrow the client regime. They took back Crimea, which was very easy to do because the people populating Crimea are Russian, identify as Russian. Even when they were part of Ukraine, they had a special status. They had their own independent parliament. So that was not a hard thing to do. Russia also supported the Donbas region and was one of the parties that established the Minsk agreements. Now, I was just talking with Alex Christoforou of the Duran the other day on a Gonzalo Lira roundtable. The link will be in the video description below if you're interested in seeing that. And he was talking about how if Ukraine stopped then and just adhered to the Minsk agreement, okay, they would have lost Crimea, but they would have kept the Donbas region and everything would have froze right there and then. But they didn't. The Western sponsors behind this client regime in Kiev told them to continue to escalate. And so they did. They broke the Minsk agreement. They continued shelling the Donbas region. More importantly, with NATO's assistance, they continued preparing to take back the Donbas region by force and also Crimea by force, which was already incorporated as part of the Russian Federation. In 2021, July 2021, I want to point this out. Maybe people remember this or maybe they don't. There's this essay that Russian President Vladimir Putin wrote. It's on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and it's all about how Russians, Ukrainians, Belarus, there is all one Slavic community, all one group of Slavic people, and how close they all are, how much they all mean to each other, how important they are historically, linguistically, culturally. And you cannot write something like that, even if it's just purely for political purposes, or especially if you actually believe it. And then on February 2022, you get a 1 million-man army, you storm into Ukraine, you knock out the power grid, the water, everything. You're vaporizing towns to scour the military units in there out. And you can't do that. You can't do that. You have to go in as a special military operation. You have to give Kiev all kinds of exits. You also have to give NATO all kinds of exits out. The ability to negotiate, the ability to freeze the conflict, the ability to rectify everything, to go back to the Minsk agreements. So that's why Russia went in as a special military operation. And then, as you can see, the West encouraged Ukraine to fight on, to avoid negotiations, to escalate in every way possible, attacking Russian territory across the border from Kharkov Oblast, attacking Crimea, shelling Donetsk city, purely just to terrorize the civilian population. There are no military targets there. And so Russia escalated accordingly. And that's where we find ourselves today. We're at a point where Ukraine refuses to negotiate. The West is encouraging them and enabling them to continue fighting on. And so Russia is able to make the next step. They're able to easily justify making the next step. And by all accounts, it looks like Russia had been preparing this all along. The referendums, the ability to mobilize at least some number of their reserves, and now that's what they're doing. And you have to think about the timing of all of this. Russia is timing all of this following Ukraine's all-in offensive, where they took everything that they had left and they threw it into these offensives. One around Kherson, a failure. One around Kharkov, a partial failure, because they failed to destroy the Russian forces that had been holding Kharkov until recently. Now, they've reached the limits of what that strategic reserve could achieve. They've expended it. The US, its NATO allies, they don't have any more on that level to lend Ukraine anytime in the foreseeable future. And now it's Russia's move. And now their move is to expand their military presence by 300,000 troops, to expand the mandate of those troops, to start hitting critical infrastructure. If Russian forces at 150,000 strong over the last 7 months could manage to destroy a third or a half of Ukraine's mobilized forces, if that's what they could do with that in 7 months, what do you think they're going to achieve in the next 7 months with 300,000 more troops and a larger mandate to use them? So that's about it for this update. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens with these referendums, with the mobilization. And one thing that I forgot to talk about was what happens between now and when these mobilized reserves are ready to actually move onto the line of contact. There are other combat-ready military formations in Russia that can be sent. The voting for the referendums is going to be over on the 27th, and then these regions could be incorporated as part of the Russian Federation. That means any combat-ready formation that Russia has can just move right in, and they could start operating in these regions before this reserve force is ready. So people who think that they've got a 3-month window or something where things are going to remain the same on the battlefield, I wouldn't count on that. If you thought this video was interesting, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on Telegram. I update that several times a day. And all of my videos on YouTube are automatically backed up on Odyssey and Rumble. It can take a day or two, but they always end up over there. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as a couple of other takes on this mobilization and the referendums by a couple of other analysts who I highly recommend and respect. In addition to that, there are also ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube videos, so if an ad ever pops up, please feel free to skip it. It's not doing me any good. If you want to support my work, you could do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. I could not do this work without that support, so thank you again. And as always, thank you for watching.